So what we have in the shop today is a 1962 MGA Mark II Coupe. Now, for those of you who don't know, this is actually a pretty rare car. They only made Mark IIs in 61 and for the first half of 62, and that's when the MGB came to market and replaced the MGA. Now, coupes, they made far fewer than roadsters. In both years, they only delivered 182 to the US. And in 62, the year of this car, there was only 26. And even total production for those 2 years for the worldwide was only 521. So you don't see these things very often. Even as rare as coupes are, the Mark II is exceptionally rare. And of course, this one's finished in iris blue, which is just an iconic color for MGs through the late 50s and early 60s. So in addition to this car actually being pretty rare, this particular car was actually the poster car, or one of the poster cars, on the Arthritis Foundation Car Show here in Dublin, Ohio in 1992, when MG's was the featured mark. And I happen to have the poster from that show. So this is this car. Now this is the first major show for MGs that I ever went to when I was still pretty young. I think I was in my right around 20 years old. And I myself at the time had a MGA Roadster that I drug out of the woods and was just sitting in many pieces in the corner of my dad's garage, and I had a pipe dream of restoring that thing, even though I had zero money to work with. And I actually had bought the t-shirt from this show with this on the front of it and wore that for many years. And now I'm working on this car. So on to why I'm working on this car. Well, it's losing oil. A little bit of a backstory. The current owners of this car bought it off of the guy, or at least the family, I'm not sure exactly which, of the guy who owned it all those years ago. He owned it for many, many years. But for the last, say, 20 years, this car's had very few miles put on it. So they took it to a show late last summer. During the dries for the show, it started using oil. And it started using quite a bit of oil. By the time they got it back home, they had put 6 quarts into it in 100, 150 miles. And it's actually 2 quarts low on oil now. And it hasn't been run since they brought it home and parked it. So we're here to determine, where's all that oil going? Did it develop a really bad oil leak and just leaking all over the ground all that ways? He said he didn't notice a lot of smoke out the tailpipe, but maybe it broke a piston ring and is burning a lot of the oil, or maybe it developed a bunch of crankcase pressure and is pushing it all out the draft tube. Well, we're going to dig in and find out. So this car, from my understanding, had had a bunch of restoration work done to it in the 80s, if I remember correctly from what they told me. But unfortunately, they didn't touch the engine compartment. Now I do see a ton of cars come through here where they tell me they've been restored. And basically the only thing that ever happened was they got painted and a new interior put on and nothing mechanically touched. Now I have no idea if any mechanical work was done then, but they obviously didn't do anything under the bonnet as far as cleaning up the engine compartment or anything is concerned. Don't know how many miles are actually on the car. The speedometer, the odometer says 4,000 and something miles. So either it's 104,000. Or when they did all that restoration work, they reset it to 0 and it's done 4,000 miles since. That's technically illegal to reset it to 0 like that, but it happens a lot. And a lot of people just document that it had X number of miles on it when the restoration was happened, and then that's how many since the restoration, and then they provide that when it gets sold. But it happens way more often than it should. So when they went to bring this over to me, they said it completely refused to start, wouldn't do anything. And I don't think they've ever tried to start it in colder temperatures. It was probably 35, 40 degrees when they were trying to start it. Of course, it was in their garage, but I think it was in an unheated garage. And they just couldn't get it started at all. So when they got it here, they did remark to me that this thing is very cold-blooded. That it's, of all the MGs they've ever had, this is the one that they just have to, it's a little harder to get going, and they've got to let it really warm up more than any other car. And they've had a lot of them before they can actually drive it and use it. Now, some of you out there who are a little more mechanically inclined will probably go, ha, I bet I know what's wrong with it. And yeah, I think I have an idea too. But before we get to doing anything in regards to that, we need to see where the oil is going. Now, probably the easiest thing to do would just be see if we can get it cranked up. Put a little bit of oil in it first, make sure there's plenty in there. Get it cranked up and see, is it dropping a bunch of oil on the ground? Is it smoking a lot out the exhaust? Things like that. And that could be our starting point. She's definitely a bit cold-blooded. It's 60 degrees in here. All right, so we got it running here. Showing decent oil pressure. And we've got ourselves a leak right there. Looks like the oil fitting right there. Probably the end of this hose itself, and this, which is one of the things we were figuring might be the problem. So probably put a new hose on there and fix that leak. Well, that leak there is a good sign that there's not any more major issues, but they are really lucky if that thing's leaking like that, that it didn't blow apart on them or start leaking even worse than that. Because if that thing comes loose, you lose all the oil really quickly. Now, as far as how bad it was running, we can do a compression test on it and a leak down test to verify what I believe is actually the problem there. So I came into today with some kind of an idea of what I thought I was going to find on this, and that partly had to do with the fact that when the owner dropped the car off, we actually did a really quick compression test on it, and we had some pretty uneven numbers. Starting from number 1 back to number 4, we had 160, 135, 105, and 155. And with number 3 being the lowest and being down that much from the rest of them, we went ahead and just turned the motor over to where both these valves were closed, fed a little bit of air in to the port here, or into the spark plug hole, and we could hear it out the tailpipe. And since one of the most common problems, or most common reasons for low compression on number 3 is burnt exhaust valve, we kind of assumed that it was a good possibility of that, but I didn't want to just call it on that. I wanted to get it running first, get it up to temperature, do another compression check, and a proper leak down test, the right way, where I take my time and do it rather than doing it super quick. And we got some surprisingly different numbers. So the numbers after running it were 152, 160, 155, 155. And the leak down test was only like 4% across the board. So that's pretty good. Well, I'm going to say the reason why we had it looking like a potential burnt valve and why we were hearing it out the tailpipe was because this engine was probably sitting for the last 6 months now with the number 3 exhaust valve hanging open, and probably developed a little bit of rust on the seat or the face of the valve to where it wasn't sealing fully. But once it was running, it settled right in, sealed, and it's good to go. So now what we're looking at is probably just a tuning issue of why it's harder to start and doesn't run so good when it's cold. Probably the carbs and the choke aren't set up as well as they could be. So I'd still need to talk to the owner real quick, but we're probably going to just be putting a couple new hoses on it, or oil lines, and then we'll probably go through, check the timing, adjust the valves, pull the carbs off, clean them, fresh set of gaskets, and tune them and get it running right.